Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our FSR policy debate. Today, we are going to focus on renewable hydrogen and industrial policies. And a renewed push to the focus on industrial policies has been recently given by the publication of the American Inflation Reduction Act. Since then, Europe has started engaging in a deep reflection on how to reduce the impact of the recent energy crisis on the industrial sector. And today's debate will then focus on at least two very topical questions. What should successful industrial policies focus on in the short, medium term? And which role will green hydrogen play in these policies? So what will be the value of future green hydrogen value chains? We will also focus not only on Europe, but also look at some potential case studies outside of Europe. The opening presentation will be given by Laima Eike, who's here with us today. Thank you, Laima, for accepting our invitation. Laima is Research Fellow at Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University, and also Research Associate at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. And Laima will mainly present the findings of a recent paper she wrote with her colleague at Harvard University and senior fellow Nicola de Blasio on green hydrogen value chains in the industrial sector. So I will give the floor to Laima in a second. The second part of today's debate will host a panel of experts, and my colleagues Andris Piebalgs and James Kneebone, who are really the minds behind the organization of this debate, will take care of introducing you to the speakers and leading the debate. Christopher Jones will then conclude this session. I invite participants to use the chat for typing questions in the course of the debate. So thank you very much to all the speakers and to my colleagues for their presence today. And Laima, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm very happy to join you today, and I'm going to share a presentation with you. And I hope everyone can see right now. As you already announced, I will present a recent paper that has been published with Energy Research and Social Science last November that I wrote together with my colleague Nicola de Blasio on green hydrogen value chains in the industrial sector. We'll focus on discuss geopolitical and market implications. Just shortly an overview about what I will present to you after some preliminary background remarks on the hydrogen market potential and industrial applications. I'll focus on drawing the geopolitical map of industrial green hydrogen applications. I'll share some country perspective with a focus on the US and the EU, since we're here today to debate those areas. And I will conclude with some geopolitical implications and policy options for energy value chains. Maybe just very shortly as an overview, you all know that the demand for hydrogen is growing and might grow by up to 700% until 2050. But the exact market outlook depends very strongly on the cost competition also with direct electrification and e-fuels. And it's debated whether and for what applications it will be needed. But there's a broad agreement that green hydrogen is mainly seen as unavoidable for the decarbonization of so-called hard-to-abate sectors as the chemical and steel industry. Those industries make up for 41% of today's current demand for hydrogen. And we focused in this paper, therefore, on the chemical industry, ammonia and methanol production, and steel production as key applications of green hydrogen in the future. Our research focuses on the question, which countries will play a critical role in green hydrogen value chains in the industrial sector, and what are associated geopolitical implications. We add empirical evidence with the paper to foremost theoretical discussions on winners and losers of a green hydrogen economy, and expand the perspective with a value chain perspective. We propose an analytical framework to elucidate the geopolitics and market implications of hydrogen value chains. And we provide policymakers and other stakeholders with some tools to make informed decisions on policy instruments and enabling infrastructure. Just shortly, also as a background on the academic debate where we situated our paper, there has been quite some discussions on the geopolitics of hydrogen, which is concerned mainly with potential gains and losses for certain countries or country groups in the energy transition. And we think looking at dynamic changes and value chains will be decisive for determining potential gains and losses in the transition. The transition and the industrial decarbonization will significantly impact existing energy trade and global value chains. And when we look into the global value chain literature, the literature highlights the benefits of value chain integration, so of a co-location, for example, of green hydrogen production and subsequent applications in the chemical industry or steel industry, because this co-location might create higher economic revenues, less transport costs, enable more control and avoid dependencies. And based on those arguments of those two research streams of the geopolitics of hydrogen and global value chain literature, we argue that countries that are able to combine the value chain segments of green hydrogen production and industries will emerge as geopolitical frontrunners in a green hydrogen economy. When we analyze which countries could take up different roles in hydrogen value chains, we focus on three criteria that we consider decisive here. One is the resource endowment of countries, looking at the renewable energy generation potential, but also space, freshwater availabilities, infrastructure potential. And a country is considered to have the potential to produce green hydrogen at scale if all the above criteria are met. Secondly, we look at ammonia, methanol, and steel production. And if a country's production in those areas is more than at least 1% of today's worldwide production, we consider a country to have this potential, because we want to focus on countries that can really contribute such a production at such scale. The third criterion that we look at is economic relatedness. It's based on the principle that the probability of a country or region to enter a new economic pursuit or to upgrade along its role in value chains growth with the numbers of related activities being present. And this is thought to be the case due to synergies among industrial clusters and related firms, but also due to skills that are built up in the workforce that are then concerned with transferable knowledge that can be used in order to create innovations and also to be transferred to similar economic activities. And a country is considered to have the potential to upgrade if the associated economic relatedness index is higher than the international average. And based on these three criteria, we classify countries in 5 different groups. And based on this framework, front-running countries are countries that are rich in resources, that have existing markets in methanol, ammonia, or steel production, and have innovative skills. Upgrading countries are resource-rich nations with innovative skills, but market constraints. And green hydrogen importers are resource-constrained nations with an existing industrial clusters within the country. On the other hand side, green hydrogen exporters are resource-rich nations without an industrial basis or upgrading potential. And so-called bystanding countries are resource-constrained nations without any markets or innovative skills in the relevant sectors that we look at. And based on these criteria, we can draw a geopolitical map. Here you see the different roles countries assume in the field of ammonia production. And looking at, for example, today's top 5 producers in the market, you see that some of them are classified as importers in our scheme, and that they might face some resource constraints going forward. On the other hand, countries that are not among today's current top 5 producers, such as Canada, for example, or Indonesia, might be able to maybe expand their production as they are in a very excellent condition for looking, with regard to this future market outlook. And we see other countries such as Mexico or Spain, Portugal, France, that also have the resource bases and related innovative skills that could help them to potentially also attract ammonia production even if they don't have those industries in place today. Here you see a similar map for methanol production, and you see that for methanol, all of today's top 5 exporters are classified as importers or face some kind of resource constraints that they will need to address going forward with the decarbonization of this production. And with regard to the steel production, you see also that, China, the United States are now very well positioned to lead here, but also Turkey. This map is a combination of the 3 previous ones. In this map, countries are only considered as frontrunners if they lead in at least 2 sectors. And you see that those criteria are only met by Canada, the US, and China. And other insights that we can draw from this comparison of those 3 sectoral applications are that most hydrogen exporters could apply hydrogen in at least 1 industrial sector. So that means that a lot of countries would not only be able to ship or export green hydrogen, but also be able to do some kind of pre-production or industrial production within the country and accumulate more value in this value chain. A lot of countries leading in one segment could upgrade and expand their activities to further applications. So we might see more concentration in those value chain dynamics. And most current production sites of steel, ammonia, and methanol face some kind of resource constraints that might or might not be able to overcome, but that need to be addressed in some way. In our paper, we analyzed then 3 case studies. So we take a look at the US, Thailand, and Germany. But since we debate today the US and the EU, I thought I'd share some thoughts on those 2 countries or regions. Firstly, the United States is in an excellent position to become a frontrunner in a green hydrogen economy with very good resource and market conditions. In general, one can also add that there has been a very supportive political economy environment for developing this sector. And there has been governmental support for the development of hydrogen across Democratic and Republican administrations, with changes in the narrative or changes in the motivation to push for this agenda. First, with a strong focus on energy security. Later on, as the United States become a net exporter of energy, the focus shifted more towards the combat of climate change, and also the general strengthening of the economic competitiveness of the United States and attracting industrial jobs again. But there has been strong governmental support across those administrations. Maybe just shortly highlighting 3 relevant policies that came about in the past few years and that will turn out to be really important for the next decade. One is the Energy Earthshot initiative that promises to bring down the costs of green hydrogen by 80% to $1 per kilogram until 2030, which would make it cost competitive with today's predominantly used gray hydrogen. Then the bipartisan infrastructure law that really supports also clean hydrogen manufacturing and really the build up of local value chains that integrate various value chain segments. And the Inflation Reduction Act that promises tax credits and direct payments to boost, again, the competitiveness of clean hydrogen and to bring down prices. And the IRA also targets in particular those hard to abate intensive industries such as the iron, steel, cement, and chemical production, again, with some local content requirements that really foster the buildup of domestic value chains, which might be relevant in our discussion here. And when we take a look at the EU, I think the question is whether the EU is really ready to have a joint strategy going forward. With regard to the resources, it can be said that the EU needs to take a strategic decision on balancing the security of supply, independence, and costs. A recent study by my colleagues, Nicola de Blasio and Alejandro Núñez Jiménez, shows that the EU in theory would have the resources to be a self-sufficient supplier of green hydrogen to meet the internal demand. But again, that might come at higher economic costs, and importing hydrogen from MENA countries or at the global market might be more cost competitive. cost efficient. And we see that some countries, such as Germany, for example, have started unilaterally some outreach activities to foster national hydrogen partnerships with African countries to source green hydrogen from those countries. And so there need to be some strategic decisions on whether, we want self-sufficient supply or where green hydrogen should be imported from. With regard to markets, one can say that the EU overall is an important player in the world steel markets and also chemical markets. But we also might see some competing interests among countries with regard to their role in those markets. We see, for example, on the one hand side, countries such as Germany that do have strong industries in this regard, but are strongly import dependent, but also countries such as, for example, Spain that have a lot of related industries and a high skill set and a lot of resources that could also become potential upgraders in these markets. And with regard to policies, we also have some national hydrogen strategies in parallel to European strategy on hydrogen. We have some EU standards that have been set, for example, in the EU Delegated Acts on renewable hydrogen production. We have several policies that target especially also those industries that we have looked at in the paper, the steel sector, the Green Deal Industrial Plan maybe is important to mention here, or the InvestEU program. And going forward, also things are being debated, such as renewable energy hydrogen auctions with a fixed premium for 10 years, which might have a similar effect than the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. And just generally, things that we might also debate later on are, of course, things such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism that really sets the scene for a level playing field, and so that investors in those industry don't have to fear, or can take those investments knowing that others will without fearing unfair competition, so to say. Just shortly focusing on geopolitical implications, our analysis shows that the gains of the emerging green hydrogen economy will not be evenly distributed. There are opportunities for countries across all world regions, but there might also be winners and losers. And it's important to say that some rivalries might emerge on the one hand side between industrialist importers and potential upgraders. But also we have already heard about some tensions between the US and the EU when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, which might be seen as some kind of subsidy that might be a trade barrier or cause some trade conflicts in the front of the WTO. And so I think to ease those tensions, agreements on standards for an equal level playing field will be important going forward. On the other hand, North-South debates might intensify to some extent, as the promise of sustainable development and green industrialization based on green hydrogen might not be replicable everywhere. It might depend on further preconditions, and this might revive previous debates on technology transfer and financial support, and also skill sharing activities in the UNFCCC. And just going forward here, on our last slide, you see some policy options for each country group, and countries should take a realistic assessment of their potential along those industrial supply chains of green hydrogen. Front-running countries should focus on supporting their industry in upscaling green hydrogen applications and the commercialization of those activities early on. And they might have an interest also in clear international standards and might form alliances or climate clubs also to reach an equal level playing field and avoid the competition in a race to the top in terms of subsidies, for example, which might be costly for everyone. Upgrading nations might assess whether it makes sense to compete with industrialized importers and might want to focus on mobilizing foreign capital for industrial projects and lower market risks, form public-private partnerships or joint ventures, and to engage strategically with front-running countries to enable learning and technology transfer. Green hydrogen importers might want to stimulate innovation in key industrial sectors and to engage in long-term contracts to reduce market risks and ensure a stable supply of green hydrogen. And here also considerations with regard to avoiding dependencies by diversifying supply sources might be important going forward. In turn, green hydrogen exporters need to decide whether to develop into a regional suppliers of green hydrogen or whether they want to focus on global markets, as these might imply different decisions on the infrastructure that needs to be built. And again, partnerships with importers might be a very good idea in order to build or to share maybe some of these transport infrastructure costs and to reduce market risks. And lastly, the group of bystanding countries should assess whether the current constraints could be overcome. Some of them can be. And furthermore, they should assess whether they need to import hydrogen for other applications beyond the industrial sector that we did not analyze in our paper. I'll leave it there and thank you very much for your attention. Here's my email address and the address of my co-author Nicola de Blasio if you have any further questions, and I'm very much looking forward to our joint debate. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to you, Laima. It was a very interesting presentation, very interesting findings, and our participants already asking for the slides to be available. So it means that you really raised a lot of interest. Thank you very much. I'm now giving the floor to my colleague Andris Piebalgs, part-time professor at the Florence School of Regulation, as he will manage the second part of this debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Ilaria. So, Laima, thank you for a very interesting report. And in this particular debate, we also wanted to look on EU-US aspects, particularly on this global change. And we have excellent panel representing, both sides of Atlantic. Dr. Michael Mehling is Deputy Director of the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, and also a professor at the University of Strathclyde Law School. We have Matthew Bravante, a hydrogen analyst at Bloomberg's New Energy Finance. He leads Bloomberg's New Energy Finance regional hydrogen analysis for Americas. And we have Ruud Kempenaar. He is now a member of Cabinet of Commissioner, but he really works with European hydrogen. It's a complicated dossier for quite some time. So the first task is rather easy for you all three. It's just, what is your main reaction what Laima presented? There have been many aspects, but which part you would particularly would like to single out before we go into the questions? So I will start with Michael.
All right, thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And just very briefly, it was a great, I think this is necessary thinking into the future about how really a new sector, essentially, really a product that is now expanding dramatically, how it will affect geopolitics and how the fallout essentially will be in the medium and longer term. I was surprised to see that your classification resulted in the Middle East essentially being an importer. So that was interesting. I had sort of assumed it would be the other way around. So that was definitely something I learned. And I was not maybe that surprised to see that ultimately the big showdown seems to be between North America and China, and especially the US and China, which often gives me headaches because geopolitically, I think we'll have a lot to deal with on that. One thing that I would probably disagree with is that the EU ETS and the CBAM are support instruments. Strong support is what you had described it as. I think that European industry at least would suggest the CBAM is only sort of trying to deflect or minimize the negative effects of having a carbon constraint. But I'll talk a little bit more about CBAM later, so we'll get back to that. But still, very great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, Matthew.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I would comment. I think the most interesting part for me was talking about this concept of, where are we going to produce hydrogen and where are the downstream industries going to pop up to either, co-locate with competitive production or move production towards, historical industries that have demand for hydrogen. I think, when you get into the nuance of these specific industries, there's arguments to be made both ways. Like if you look at the US, there's a large steel industry, but it's primarily electric arc furnaces. So the DRI opportunity is smaller than it initially looks if you're just looking at total steel consumption. But then a place like Brazil that might have extremely competitive hydrogen, doesn't have a huge steel industry, at least comparatively today, but could in the future because of the ore grades and the cost of hydrogen production there. So I just think that's a really interesting ongoing debate about, as the cost of green hydrogen fundamentally changes, where we can make hydrogen for competitively economically, how does that change where we use hydrogen in the conventional industries that we already use hydrogen for?
Thank you. Ruud, what would your take of
Linus? I was very happy because so one of the things which we tried to do when we developed the European hydrogen strategy in 2020 is kind of introduce this concept of hydro ecosystems. I think you're calling it hydro value chains, but really kind of think about it as an ecosystem. And that's something which we've tried to also, in terms of our policies, try to kind of perpetuate through. Always think about it as an ecosystem as a whole. And then maybe that's one of the questions which I have also for you analytically, how infrastructure in these value chains play a role, because I think in the EU, that will be a very important one. Now, secondly, of course, you do your analysis per member state, but sitting here in Brussels, we look at the EU as a whole. So that, of course, is the second question I have for you. How, if you would do this analysis, let's assume, of course, that the EU operates as a whole, where do you end up at an aggregate level? The other one I have, and I think I'm also very interested in kind of the, not only the other panelists, but also the people listening to here, is that, of course, the hydrogen industry is very dynamic. So the volumes which we're talking about in 2025 vis-a-vis 2030 vis-a-vis 2050 are going to be very, very different. And so is it possible, or is it likely that some of those qualifications you have might change over time? So yes, if you look, for example, at hydrogen consumption in Europe in 2050, we're talking about 50 to 60 million tons, and some of our analysis it really changes, but it's really a factor of 5 more than what we're looking at in 2030. And what we're looking at in 2030 is already 100 times more than what we have today, because we start at the base. So how do you see the dynamics over there? And then last but not least, of course, the hydrogen value chain is important, but we always try to look at the hydrogen value chain in the context of a full energy transition. And to give you a specific example, if we're talking to the steel sector, they say we need lots of hydrogen for our blast furnaces, but we also need lots of renewable electricity for those electric arc furnaces which come afterwards. So it's not just hydrogen what we need, but we also need the cheap renewable electricity, being integrated into the system. So how, from this energy system perspective, fits this kind of strength of hydrogen value chains into your analysis? Those will be my first kind of initial thoughts listening to your presentation.
So, Laima, you have now a chance really to respond to Ruud, to Matthew, to Michael, what they have said before we move to the questions, because our intention is not only to torture you, but also to give a bit of torture to them, so to get also something out from them. So, Laima.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and reactions. I think that's really valuable also for me. Yeah, I would agree with your remarks, Michael, of the CBAM, that it's definitively a measure that's meant to balance out the internal carbon price, and yeah, but I'm also curious to see in general in the dynamics and tensions also in this debate between European industrial policies and potential US American industrial policies, where you would situate that. Yeah, with regard to potential relocations of industries, I think that's definitely a very interesting field and dynamic, and we cannot know whether those industries will move, for example, to Brazil. But I think it's very important to have in mind that yeah, the future value chains of in those sectors might look very different from today's. And it's important to consider several factors that come into play here. And I think transport is one of them. Skills, as I mentioned, economic relatedness might play a strong role, but also potentially other factors and support policies or governmental strategic industrial policies might also play an important role with regard to the potential relocations of industries and investments going forward. And yeah, I think it's very interesting to look at those dynamics going forward. Yeah, I agree that our analysis looked at European countries as single countries, and it would be very interesting to look at the EU dynamic as a whole. And I think the EU as a whole is definitely a much more relevant actor than the single countries. And with regard to, for example, the market shares, when we list them for the whole as a EU, the EU, for example, in the steel sector, they are the second largest steel producer after China. And yeah, of course, the picture looks a little bit different when we consider the EU as a whole. And I think the EU as a whole could become also a frontrunner in the green hydrogen economy, but it depends a lot on whether the countries collaborate together and share a joint strategy in this regard. But definitely there would be a strong potential to play a much more important role if one takes the market power of those countries together. And I think lastly, with regard to a systems perspective, I totally agree that it's very important to look at the not only the role of green hydrogen, but also of cheap renewable electricity. And I think in some situations or with regard to some, it's important to look that there can be some trade-offs sometimes with regard to building up renewable energy capacity, especially when we look at several countries in which energy access, for example, rates are also still low, but we consider potential export countries of green hydrogen. In some of those countries, there might definitely be a trade-off between exporting green hydrogen on the one hand side and raising electricity access rates within the country, or fostering an energy transition within the country and coming to 100% renewable energy in the electricity system within those countries. And I think we need to ensure that element of additionality of an electricity generation when it comes to green hydrogen generation, to really see minimize those trade-offs and not to see any adverse effects there. And therefore, I think it's very important to look at the whole thing in a systems perspective.
Thank you, Laima. So we will try now to kick off the questions. I will look what you have sent in chat and question and answer box. There have been some questions at least, please write, but I will now give the opportunity to ask questions to my colleague, James. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andres. Yes, indeed, as Andres says, we're now moving into the sort of more open and discursive portion of the session. So please come forward, everyone, with your questions for our panelists. They cover lots of different areas of expertise, so really make use of that. I'll kick things off with a round of questions, one to each, starting first with Matthew, if that's okay. And I wanted to ask you specifically about the conditions for operation of electrolyzers in the US. And now basically now that we have a more or less final version of the EU's delegated act on renewable hydrogen production, I wanted to know how this sort of state of play compares in the US, RE drafting of corresponding rules, because we've heard about the IRA and these sort of support mechanisms, but my understanding is that the sort of critical methodology for the operation of these plants are in development, but not necessarily finalized. So do you have an impression of the situation in the US regarding the likely strictness and the parameters of these conditions? And how close do you think we are to seeing an announcement? So yeah, interested to get your views on that.
Sure. So I'll give just a little bit of more basic backgrounds on the IRA for the folks who may not be as familiar, and then I'll try and answer those questions specifically. So the IRA in the US is a little bit different than the way the support mechanisms will work across Europe. It is a supply side subsidy. It's a production tax credit. So for each kilogram of hydrogen that you produce, you will get a set value of money. It depends on your carbon intensity, but the sort of eye-popping number that people often quote is $3 per kilogram. And you have what they call well-to-gate emissions below 0.45 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And the way that they are describing well-to-gate includes anything to do with fuel processing or fuel extraction, but does not include kind of the embedded materials. So you can think about in a electrolytic pathway, it would not have to do with any of the construction materials of the electrolyzers, the solar panels, the wind farms, but it would have to do with the carbon intensity of the electricity source. And then with, a thermochemical pathway, like a common methane reformation, it would have to do with the extraction, processing, and transportation of the natural gas fuel, but not necessarily the steel that's going into the plant or the pipelines. The reason why I say this is, that at least as I understand it, the EU is its directive is more, intentionally focused on electrolysis, but in the US, we theoretically are not focused on one or the other. Our analysis shows that the hydrogen tax credit will predominantly go to electrolytic pathways, so green hydrogen producers, because we also have a carbon capture tax credit here in the US that is more advantageous for blue hydrogen producers to use. So we think most of the production tax credit will end up going to green producers, and most green producers will strive to maintain a level below 0.45 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen to get that $3 per kilogram. So with that said, where we're at specifically, the bill said a number of things, but left most up for interpretation and implementation. So the way it works in the US is the piece of legislation was passed. You can go read it, and it outlines a few specifics. For example, a project cannot take both the carbon capture credit and the 45V, the hydrogen tax credit. It can double dip on the tax credits available to solar and wind technologies and hydrogen technologies. So your power asset will also be subsidized if it is going to feed an electrolyzer. But there are still a lot of things that we don't know. And the things that we don't know were very similar to the things that Europe didn't know until the directive was passed. So we're still waiting for guidance on additionality of renewables and then time of use are kind of the two big ones. There's, it's really anybody's guess. I've spent time with the folks in the US government who are drafting these policies. I can't tell you anything about what's going on in their brain. I can tell you that they are thinking about these issues in a way that I would think is reasonable and really trying to weigh what's best. If I had to guess, I would say that we're going to end up with something similar where it's more of a hybrid approach where at least the time of use is less strict in the beginning and it's eventually ratcheted up to that kind of hourly standard that most folks want to see. But it's really to be determined. And all I can give you in terms of concrete answers is we should know by the end of the summer. The deadline for the Treasury and the IRS to come out with guidance on the IRA is August 16th. So I think at some point in the summer, we'll be hearing similarly to the way that Europe just said exactly how these rules are going to work.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. I would also encourage, our other panelists, if you have questions corresponding to any of the answers from each other, then, raise your hand and feel free to chime in during. In the meantime, I'll come to Michael. We've seen, for example, that the hydrogen production rules in the Delegated Act, Europe's Delegated Act, will also apply to imports from third countries, as well as also eventually being covered by the CBAM. We also know that the Commission is working on a certification system for these imports, likely building on existing schemes for biomass and biogas imports. I was wondering, given your experience working on the CBAM and trade law in general, what your first impressions are about this as an approach and the benefits, the limitations, what sort of challenges you might envisage associated with the proposal of this nature.
Sure, great. Thanks, James. And I'll pick up sort of where I left off in my initial reactions to Laima's excellent presentation. I mentioned that in a way, the CBAM is a very fundamentally different animal. So if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, the US has gone for a multitude of reasons, primarily political economy reasons, for an all carrots approach, if you like. Silke's question in the discussion essentially encapsulates that. How is that affecting, investments that would have perhaps happened in Europe that are now being attracted into the US given this very attractive environment? And the CBAM is a very different approach. So it complements, it's intrinsically linked to the EU ETS, a carbon pricing regime, a sticks approach. And what it does is to level the playing field, as Laima correctly stated, it extends this carbon price to imports from other countries for certain categories of products. And hydrogen is now included in the provisional agreement that came out in mid-December from the trilogue process. We don't have the final regulation, but we know that it is going to be included in the products that the CBAM applies to. It was not something the Commission initially proposed in its July 2021 proposal, but it is something that the European Parliament in particular pushed to have included. But again, this CBAM and ETS regime is quite different from, for instance, the Renewable Energy Directive regime and the delegated acts under that. So what you just alluded to. And each of these, as is common under EU law, you have the regulations or directives, and then you have the Commission empowered to adopt sort of implementing technical guidance, methodologies, processes, etc. So we're getting more detailed rules on both. But we already know from the CBAM provisional agreement that the CBAM, while included in the Annex 1 that states that it's a covered product, will not be included for its indirect emissions. So emissions from electricity generation will not be included in the calculation of the carbon intensity of imported hydrogen, for instance. So technically, from what we know now, before we have more details on implementing acts, etc., you would have to treat electrolytic hydrogen produced with coal-fired electricity the same way, essentially, as you would treat electrolytic hydrogen from renewable electricity, which seems, of course, an awkward outcome. And there will have to be some sort of ways of reconciling those two regimes. The problem with the CBAM is that many of these products benefit from indirect cost compensation under the EU ETS to offset sort of the cost pass-through of the carbon price in electricity. So that's why we cannot adjust for the indirect emissions, because again, in some member states, these pass-through carbon costs in electricity are not actually priced. There's a compensation mechanism, and under trade law, you cannot adjust with a border carbon adjustment for something that's not being imposed domestically, which creates sort of a bit of a conundrum. And until we have resolved this asymmetry, if you like, between indirect cost compensation, albeit only in some member states, and the fact that it can only adjust for something that has been priced domestically, we may not have a foolproof way of imposing, costs based on the indirect emissions. So there is a risk that these delegated acts under the Renewable Energy Directive and the CBAM regulation may not be fully aligned, and it will, I think, be tricky to address that. I want to give credit to some colleagues of mine, Olivier Mbeau, who is in the audience here, and other colleagues at the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. We're starting to dig into this, specifically including hydrogen and the CBAM. There's a few other questions as well, but I won't go into detail there. Generally, when you include a product category in something like the CBAM, you always have to worry how far up the value chain do you go, how far downstream, essentially, in the supply chain. And whenever you set the threshold, there's always concerns that there will be some value chain substitution, circumvention possibilities. Clearly, that could also be with hydrogen, for instance, inclusion of carriers or derivatives of hydrogen. If not all are included, you could see sort of course, some substitution effects that are not intended. Other fuels could suddenly benefit when it comes to imports. There's many questions that have to be dealt with. But, I think the European Commission has already done an admirable job with the CBAM and with the Renewable Energy Directive. They know how to do it, but it's still a headache, I'm sure.
Yes, indeed, Michael. Many issues to be resolved, no? But you really brought up some interesting points. So I think it's high time we pass the floor to Ruud to perhaps respond to a few of the things you've heard so far, as well as I'll give you a general question to go with as well, which is just to reflect and highlight again. I'm sure people in the audience are familiar, but there's been this really intense process going on, working to finalize the proposal for the DA, and certainly we all congratulate you for this very rigorous work. One of the main sort of critiques or issues that seems to keep cropping up in the preparatory phase was the complexity of the rules, and therefore the corresponding quality of understanding of the implications and specificities among stakeholders. So my feeling has always been that given the significant range in emissions that it's possible to have with electrolytic hydrogen, I mean, Michael was just talking about coal-fired versus renewable electrolytic hydrogen, and the amount of energy being discussed, that this was just one of those topics that could only be simplified to a certain point whilst maintaining its integrity. But having now released a more or less final version, I was just wondering how you reflect on that process and the reception of the end product, particularly in terms of complexity and comprehension amongst people in the sector. And is that now a big part of your focus as this goes to Council and Parliament, really ensuring that those decision makers are really clear and well informed?
Yeah, thank you, James, for the questions. I can assure you it's not almost final, it's final. So for everyone, it is a final document. The question indeed still is whether the member states and the European Parliament agree with the proposal, but the text as it stands is final. Now, I think at the core of our proposal is something which people relatively easily understand. And that is that we've seen in Europe, actually, if you look at the project pipeline, kind of two kinds of projects. One kind of project which produces renewable hydrogen and connects an electrolyzer directly to new built renewables. And if you look at actually at the European industry, about 50 or even more than that, of 50% of the projects are such projects. You build big new renewables, you connect an electrolyzer to those renewables. So you directly use that renewable electricity and then produce hydrogen. So it's a very simple concept and a lot of projects focusing on that. Of course, that is only possible in those places where you have a lot of renewable electricity available. Now, if you look at the core of the Hydrogen Delegated Act, that's exactly what that emulates. It allows those projects to develop. But if you want to use the grid, so if you want to use the grid to get electricity to your electrolyzer, then that renewable electricity needs to be produced at the hours, or needs to be consumed at the hours that it's being produced. It needs to be located in the same region where you have no congestion. So that concept is there, and it's very kind of well understood by everyone and anyone. Now, what I think the discussion has been about, and it's been a good discussion from that perspective, is about three aspects. First of all, the industrial policy. Of course, in order to build large-scale electrolyzers, you need more renewables. So how do we accommodate for that in an initial phase? So that's one part of the debate. And of course, we provided rules to accommodate for that. The second one is, how do you integrate hydrogen production also into the electricity market design that we have in Europe? We have prices which change every 15 minutes, really showing scarcity at certain points. We have rules for curtailment, etc. So the second piece of rules that we introduced is, okay, how do you allow those electrolyzers actually to engage and interact with the electricity market as we have it, making sure that they're running on those hours that is also beneficial for the industry system as a whole. And then the third piece of the discussion has been, okay, the Europe as a whole is diverse. We have countries which largely depend on coal. We have countries which are completely, or not completely, but they have to a large extent decarbonized their electricity mix. We have islands. So how do you take those system perspective also into account when you're producing hydrogen, especially in those systems which have been already or kind of are coming to a situation where almost all of the electricity that is being produced is renewables. Now that system will evolve over time as well. So we also have to build in some rules about how can, as systems become more renewables, the rules be adapted as well. So it's been a long process. I really hope the US can stick to its 16th of August deadline. We also had a deadline, but everyone knows we run over that for quite a bit. But I think the core is very well understood with everyone, and I think the responses so far have been very good, and I'm positive that both the Council and the European Parliament will see the value of this delegated act. Now, if I'm allowed to, I quickly wanted to also help Michael in this analysis of the CBAM. Because there's one part which is not that difficult. There's lots of difficult parts, but there's one part which is not that difficult. And that is that the renewable hydrogen, which follows the rules in the delegated acts, has to be certified, irrespectively of whether that is being produced within the EU or internationally. So that means that if renewable hydrogen is produced in a third country, and that renewable hydrogen wants to be recognized to contribute to the demand targets that the European Commission has proposed, or the renewable energy targets which are already in place, then that renewable hydrogen needs to come with a certificate, and the certificate needs to have the CO2 intensity of that hydrogen. So at any point in time when renewable hydrogen would enter the shores of the EU, we actually have a certificate which exactly shows what is the CO2 intensity of that renewable hydrogen. Now, if it's other hydrogen, which is not certified as renewable, it doesn't have a certificate. So obviously there the difficulties appear. But if it's renewable hydrogen, if you have the certificate, you know exactly what the CO2 intensity is of that renewable hydrogen when it enters kind of the shores within the EU. Now we're going to put the same rules in place for what we call low carbon hydrogen. So those will be hydrogen where the feedstock is not renewables or renewable electricity, but could be other sources of energy. But again, that would come with a certification scheme such that we know what the CO2 intensity of that hydrogen is at a European shore. And then, of course, you have hydrogen produced from biomass, which is also taking place, can also take place. And there the certification scheme is already in place, actually. So that indeed we know. So we know exactly at what point in time certified hydrogen arrives at the shore and has a CO2 intensity. And that, of course, is one of the key features that we need to know to help that integrate into the CBAM.
Okay, super. Thanks very much, Ruud. Also for building on what Michael opened already earlier in his intervention. So finally, for this round, I will come to Laima, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience. So, of course, we're focusing mostly on the US and the EU here, but the scope of your paper goes beyond that. So I wanted to ask more or less if you had any surprises or examples outside of the EU and the US that surprised you, or maybe people are not so familiar with, or might be interesting to our audience, that are countries or regions that have a sort of intriguing and perhaps novel capacity potential to build up segments in these hydrogen value chains that we should be looking at and perhaps aren't getting enough attention?
Well, I think there are definitely countries across all world regions that are very well equipped for green hydrogen production. And it's important. Well, one thing that maybe kind of was a little bit surprising or was interesting to see was that in Europe or in we often look at or debate about African countries as a source for green hydrogen imports for domestic industries. And I think doing the analysis, I think it was really very interesting to see that a lot of those countries that are parts of hydrogen partnerships, for example, with Germany, or also within the scheme of the European hydrogen partnerships, actually do have a lot of related industries operating, and that some of these countries might be very much interested in not only exporting green hydrogen, but rather accumulating more value added within their country, and to also participate in at least some pre-productive steps along the value chains in the chemical industry and also in the steel sector. And that was a general insight from our analysis that was also kind of reaffirmed in a recent conference in the German Foreign Office that we also both participated in last December, where also some participants from these hydrogen partnerships voiced their interest in participating in hydrogen value chains beyond being merely like resource exporters. And really, a lot of countries hope for that kind of green industrialization that might come with green hydrogen and the hydrogen economy. And I think these wishes or hopes or concerns are something that should be taken seriously and should be heard, and should be would be important to consider when those partnerships are being created, in order to really see where are mutual benefits, where are joint interests, in when these partnerships are being formed, and how can they be designed in a way that benefits economic development in both regions. And I think that's something that maybe deserves a little more attention sometimes in the political debates.
No, I agree entirely. For me, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of the development of this sector is this tension between the cooperation and the collaboration, for example, on technology sharing, the capacity building, these kind of things, and then this sort of parallel discussion we have on geopolitical tension, subsidy race, and the competition. You know, where do you draw the line there and the balance point between sharing technology, sharing skills, capacity building for ramping up of capacity outside of your borders, and at the same time, you know, keep in tension the protection of industry and looking after, say, for example, a technological advantage that exists in Europe at the moment with a huge import ambition, you know, and also justice, having justice in these value chains and ensuring that we're being good energy partners on all of these kind of aspects. So I appreciate the analysis that your paper does to sort of bring some light on this, and I'd be interested also to get some of the other panelists' views on this, because I know, for example, Michael has some experience working on projects Global South, Global North, and the impacts of these relations. So hopefully that's something we can circle back to. But for now, thank you all for your responses on these questions. I'll pass the floor back to Andres, who could maybe give us a few questions from our audience.
Yeah, audience is very active, so I will start with easy questions. It's to Laima. The easy question one is, why it's only fresh water? Why it can't be desalinated water? Why you put it as a resource? And the second question, have you taken into account the cost of transport of hydrogen? Ronnie, in his question says, well, basically to transport the same amount of energy, you would need the fleet of 4 times bigger than LNG fleet. So how do you deal with the transport issue?
With regard to freshwater, we put it as a requirement for the hydrogen production, and it's sure there are some technologies like that enable, for example, the desalination of seawater, that could be a technology that might help to overcome some kind of resource constraints in the area of fresh water, and that some countries have, but nevertheless, it's some kind of constraint the country would need to deal with. Seawater desalination might be also very energy intensive, where additional energy is needed, and also might have some adverse environmental effects also in different areas. So it's something that can be used. There are some options to address some of the resource constraints that we described in our paper. That's true, but it might be something that needs some kind of policy attention, and that might be addressed in order to avoid some conflict over the use of scarce water resources within a country. And with regard to transport, our analysis looked at the potential within each country, and we didn't really talk about, or we didn't model transport streams across world regions. That's something that part of our research team has done in different papers. For example, one publication that I could recommend is a report that my colleague Nicola de Blasio and Alejandro Núñez Jiménez did together, where they really modeled the transport costs of energy imports for Europe, given 3 different scenarios, and looking really at global trade streams via shipping, and in comparison to a more regional import regime based on pipelines. So that's something that I can definitely recommend to look into, but it's not part of this paper. But yes, definitely long distance transport is something where it might be of interest not only to look at the shipment of hydrogen, but also into the shipment of rather converted products such as ammonia. So maybe it might make more sense to ship ammonia than hydrogen. So there might definitely be some open questions yet with regard to long distance transport of hydrogen.
And now the difficult question, Laima, to you. The problem with this analysis you found out is that you need to classify the country. As soon as you classify, you get into trouble. And now the trouble is there. Why Saudi Arabia is importer and not potential exporter?
Yes, it's exactly out of the issue of how we dealt with freshwater constraints that we previously already debated. So it's something that potentially can be resolved, putting a lot of investment into water desalination plants into the country, but it's definitively also something that the country needs to take care of, or needs to be where a holistic approach is needed in order to take care of the issue of water scarcity, in order to avoid internal conflicts about the distribution of this scarce resource.
Okay, thank you. Now to Ruud. Ruud, on delegated acts, there is a good question. Exemptions to the additionality principle and provisional monthly temporal correlation. Will not it ramp up demand on thermal power in the short term? Have you considered this?
Absolutely, we've considered it, and of course, this is one of the trade-offs that we had to do in developing the Hydrogen Delegated Act. Now, first of all, I think it's important. Well, three aspects there. First of all, it's important that there are indeed exemptions, but of course, these exemptions are temporary. So hydrogen producers which will start producing earlier are indeed exempt from additionality, so they can sign renewable PPAs with existing power installations, but it still needs to be renewable PPAs. And of course, these will only be over the half-time of the life of their project. So they will eventually need to sign these retire those power purchase agreements and have new ones signed with new unsubsidized renewables. Now, the second one, of course, is that the Hydrogen Delegated Act does not stand by itself. We have, of course, also the Renewable Energy Directive proposal, which is still being discussed, where we have already seen that both member states and the European Parliament have already agreed that we are increasing our targets for renewables from 32% to 40% in 2030. And now we also have our proposals to increase that further to 45%. This sometimes sounds as a percentage, but it's a percentage of final energy consumption. It's not the percentage in the electricity mix, it's really final energy consumption. So these are actually really, really big, ambitious targets, which means that there will be, I can't say no, but almost all of the investments in new electricity will be renewable electricity. So there will be a massive demand for renewable electricity coming in. Now, we also have, of course, the resilience and recovery funds that we had after COVID. Again, there we tied that into the Green Deal. So lots of those funds are going to and developing new renewables into the system. And actually there you see that a lot of the financing goes to electrolyzer projects, which are also bringing in new additional renewable power installations already in their project proposals. And I think that's the third one. Yes, we have an exemption there, and that allows indeed for the scale up of the electrolyzer market, because otherwise we would have to, in some cases, wait 5 to 7 years for the new renewables have been built. But actually we see a lot of projects in the industry already planning those new renewables to come in, simply because they're cheaper. They're cheaper than the electricity market prices. They're cheaper than the existing PPAs that they can get on the market. So there is certainly also the economic element which pushes those new renewables to come into the system.
Ruud, there is another question, also a very easy one. It is where the money will come for infrastructures that you need to build in Europe or for hydrogen. Connect Europe is relatively small. Yeah. Where the big money will come? Do you have any answer for this?
Yes, we do. We do actually, and that's in the hydrogen and gas decarbonization package. I am very sorry for all these names and terms, but what we essentially are doing is we are creating a new market, and indeed we don't have existing hydrogen infrastructure which is public available. So on the one hand side, we do have public funds, and we are specifically targeting those public funds to projects which are cross-border. So that's why we're doing our EU financing towards, but that is obviously not sufficient. And it's actually for those people who are here, all of those public projects which have now been proposed in terms of hydrogen infrastructure are publicly available online. So it's a really good resource to look at. But what the hydrogen and gas decarbonization package does is essentially set out the rules on how hydrogen pipelines need to be financed. And of course, we have already quite some experience in the EU on how to finance pipelines because we've done this for gas. And now for hydrogen, we think it's a different market. It's not going to be the same as the gas market and the way gas infrastructure has been developed. But of course, there we are putting in place rules such that the hydrogen project infrastructure developers can get those investment backs through the tariffs that they can apply to the use of those hydrogen infrastructure.
Good, thanks. Michael, there is a question, I think, for you. How to be sure that the hydrogen production is channeled to sector with best greenhouse gas abatement potential, that it is not wasted, if it is such a valuable commodity?
Well, I think that's a very all-encompassing question. I mean, the theoretical answer would always be use a market-based approach to have the market determine where the biggest social benefit can be achieved. But I'm not quite sure that that's simply something you can drop into this complex portfolio of policies. I mean, it is really an industrial policy package, as Ruth mentioned, on infrastructure, supply side measures, some demand side measures. So I think their theory probably doesn't help us so much, and we'll have to hope and expect that the market, in combination with political and policy guidance together, sort out ultimately for the time that it's a scarce good. Eventually, of course, we hope that we can address and scale up supply sufficiently that the scarcity is no longer so pronounced. But it'll be sort of, I think, an iterative back and forth for many, many years.
Thank you. Now I would like to Matthew. I will read the question because I am not a big expert on IRA. It comes from Harry Blanco, and he asks, are there any indications of the maximum funds that will be allocated to hydrogen PTC? An estimate from the Congressional Budget Office has 13.2 billion for hydrogen, but I understand that depends on details. What happens if the number of applications is too high and it's add up to just too much funding needed? When will this be clear? In essence, well, how bankable is IRA for hydrogen? I think that is perhaps in the question.
Sure. Before we get there, I just want to comment on the previous statement. I think, you know, when thinking about market-based incentives, so in the US, and I saw a comment earlier on, the US is a complete carrot approach. We're just trying to make hydrogen as cheap as possible, and hope that you know, spurs a hydrogen economy. But I think in terms of looking at how you decarbonize the highest potential sectors in terms of abatement, we're going to need some other sort of policy structure. The reason I say that is just because as a person who watches the US market that now has this very lucrative tax credit, we're seeing projects and ideas that might work in perverse ways. An example I always like to use would be replacing the baseload natural gas generation with hydrogen. Theoretically, in terms of practicality, it's very easy to do. Or at least relatively easy. You can blend, you know, up to 30%, even more probably in most turbines today. And you see a lot of these projects going forward that they don't have to worry about the midstream, the transportation and storage of hydrogen per se. They can just build, you know, the electrolyzer next to the gas-powered turbine, blend in. So there are, and in my opinion, that would be as compared to other uses of hydrogen, just replacing kind of the baseload functionality of natural gas on the grid with hydrogen would be a poor use. But it is one of the easier uses for hydrogen, practically speaking, you know, actually moving the molecules around. So I think there's probably more that needs to be done in terms of incentivizing the right sectors to use hydrogen, and maybe not even incentivizing them, but supporting the midstream infrastructure that they need, because the highest value places to use hydrogen in these heavy industrial applications need a lot of hydrogen, and they need it around the clock. And that is not something that currently pairs with the way renewable hydrogen is structured today, especially if we're trying to match hourly renewables production with electrolysis consumption. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done on the midstream, a lot that needs to be done on the policy side in order to make sure we're using this hydrogen in a place that it should be used. Now, in terms of the way the IRA works, so it's a production tax credit, and as long as you adhere to the rules, you get the tax credit. There is a CBO. So the CBO is the Congressional Budget Office. It's basically whenever you see, a bill is going to cost $400 billion in the US, that is an estimate that comes from this, nonpartisan body of government that estimates how much things cost. So the CBO put it at about 13 billion through 2032, but that is as good of a guess as anybody's. They try and use some historical activity to project future demand for the tax credit. But as most folks on the call know, hopefully the future demand for electrolytic hydrogen or just hydrogen projects in the US generally will be larger in the future than it has been in the past. So we think it's a rather inaccurate way to estimate it. We think it could be double or triple that by the time 2032 rolls around. The real question is, how does the supportive infrastructure get built, and how are the demand side folks incentivized? Because in the US, it's really just this carrot approach. It's really just a supply side incentive. So I think there will be a lot of logistical challenges related to taking this electrolytic hydrogen and making it available to an industrial user that might not be right next to the wind farm, might not be right next to the solar farm, and making it available at all the times that the industrial user wants to use it. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Before going to some detailed questions that are here, I would like to ask all of you about one of the questions that is very much in public domain. It is like a competition between US system, or I would say more correctly is that it is more impact of IRA on Europe. In a way, I would ask you how strongly this influences of the legislation, because EU and US will always be different. It's different build, it's different logics. They will not use the same instruments. Is this current debate on the influence from one side and calling that the investments go on one side or another side so devastating, or you would say, well, it's just a media overreaction to some particularities of Inflation Reduction Act? So I perhaps would start with Laima. How do you feel this competitive element? Is it bad, or it's really, well, you need to live with this and not too much worry about it?
I would say to some extent the competition for some competition between the US and the EU can have even beneficial effects, I guess, as long as both regions try to attract or try to use different approaches. They can also experiment with different approaches that might work differently, and to some extent a variety in policy instruments might also help us to find the right and most effective policy instruments in general. So probably on general terms, having different approaches across the world to reach a common goal of kickstarting a green hydrogen economy might be a good thing. And in general, a new competition or competing dynamic with regard to some call it a race to the top of how can we best support the decarbonization of heavy industries is generally also something that's beneficial for all of us in the end if we succeed in one way or the other. if we really achieve more climate change in the end and a faster transition on the one way or the other. But of course, we need also to watch out that this competition doesn't result in a deterioration of competition, that we could have adverse effects for everyone as well if we see a lot of industries and jobs moving around and having not an equal level playing field that would give also some stability that's needed for investment decisions of different actors. And I think something that also would need to be considered is that that kind of competition is something that not every country in the world can enter. Other regions cannot heavily subsidize their economies and the use of green hydrogen in a way that the US and Europe perhaps can. And I think it would be beneficial for all countries to have really clear rules or an equal level playing field in this transition worldwide, so to say. So I think there are several aspects that should be considered and that are important to consider in this. But in theory, a plural approaches can have also positive aspects.
Michael, what is your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a question that I also expend a lot of thought and concern on. I mean, I am myself a transit like Lima, I was born in Europe. I live in the US. And if you just look sort of around the media reporting and the initial analysis of the real impacts and attempts to robustly estimate what is the overall amount of subsidies, as Matthew was just saying, the tax credits, for instance, are uncapped. So we don't even yet really know what the uptake will be on the US side. But there is this perception that the US has just put out an absolutely unprecedented amount of very attractive incentives that de-risk investment, that don't only cover capital investments, but also operating expenses with the PTC, et cetera, that changes the game and makes it really attractive also for European green economy producers to look there for their next investments. And now we hear things like green leakage. And so attempts to really sort of break it down and disaggregate and come up with robust figures. Well, how much investment do we have in which categories, in which parts of the value chain, et cetera, if we add up member state and European Union investments on the EU side versus what's happening in the US? I guess the picture is going to be a little bit less dramatic because Europe has not been innocent in relying on subsidies for a long time on many different aspects of green energy. Obviously, we know that, but this recent development in the US has kind of changed the perceived equation. However, I would still say, I mean, I think that the way that, the US is only giving carrots and it's this sort of long-term, fairly generous support, uncapped, as I said, also covering operating expense, that does, I think, shift the balance somewhat. That does tilt the level playing field in a very favorable way for the US. And one can argue that the US is a rare economy, can do this. Reserve currency, can take on debt in a way that some European member states cannot, even unconstrained by state aid guidelines. So I do see problems there. And so the question to me in the end is this a zero-sum game where we compete about rare, scarce resources, rare earth metals, critical components and minerals and so on? Or is it a rising tide for all in the green economy? Are we wasting a lot of political capital bickering around CBAM? The US is concerned about CBAM, of course, and the EU concerned about the Inflation Reduction Act in particular, while at the same time other competitors like China can kind of take advantage of that. I mean, they are certainly, it's a whole different ballgame in how much status or government intervention happens in that country. So I'm concerned. I think it's probably overblown, but it's not without some justification to be feeling like in the EU, we have to now find an answer, a realistic response. And of course, we're hearing all the different elements of that.
Matthew, what are your take on this?
Sure. I guess just to bring some numbers to the discussion. So at Bloomberg in 2019, when we first built the hydrogen team, did this year-long report where we tried to look at all aspects, and the number we kind of came to before cumulative subsidies by 2030 to kind of scale the electrolysis supply chain was about 150 billion cumulatively. and we track this number. And as Michael said, it's an impossible number to track, down to the dollar, because some of these subsidy schemes aren't capped. But we think it's around 140 billion right now promised. So, and that's up from 100 billion 6 months ago or a year ago. So I think we're well on our way in terms of the amount of capital from the public side that we need. Because again, I mean, fundamentally, this electrolysis product, it's a modular product that, depending on which technology you use, isn't that expensive in terms of the bill of materials. So it's really just about supply chain maturity. It's about scale. And we expect, this whole hydrogen economy concept is based on the fact that electrolyzers are going to get a lot cheaper. And the only way to do that is to scale the electrolyzer market. And I think, these public subsidies do that. And, whether the EU is now politically incentivized to put more subsidies in because the US did, or vice versa, I think at the end of the day, it's a good thing. For me, what's much more concerning from a policy perspective from both is one that, a lot of the folks entering the electrolysis space are from the traditional electricity business, and moving molecules is a different game. And I think the midstream required both for, transcontinental pipeline-based shipping and, intercontinental shipping. I mean, there's a lot of hope being put into moving hydrogen around the world, and not a lot of thought into how we're going to do it, economically. So I think that's a big concern. And the other big concern, and Michael touched on it a little bit, is just if you look at the announcements for manufacturing capacity of electrolysis systems, I mean, China is taking off in a way that, even at our greatest ambitions, the EU and the US are not. So I think, we need to be more thoughtful about, where we're supplying equipment from, and, where and what kind of implications that has for, geopolitical security and things like that, because we're certainly treading down a path where, China is going to become the export capital of the world for electrolysis systems, much in the way that they export PV panels. So I think, and is that necessarily a bad thing? I'm not here to say that, but I do think, as far as the things we are bickering about, there are a few things that we probably should bicker more about, and a few things we should bicker less about.
Thank you, Ruud. You have heard this question, and I believe sometimes on an emotional level even. So what is your answer to this challenge?
Yes, so of course, I think, and that's what I think we publicly already said many times, we welcome action on climate change. I mean, this is something that we've been, pushing for at any international debate whatsoever. Of course, the energy crisis, which is particularly hurting, EU industries with very high fossil fuel prices, of course, is putting everyone here on alert in the EU, because it's very clear that now there's no, we can't wait a decade and then do something. We really need to do it now. That's absolutely clear. What I would like to add to the discussion right now at the moment is that I think industry policy is not only about subsidies, and that I think is really something that we are trying to put forward from our side, but also in discussions with industry. I mean, I think skills is an enormous important kind of factor in this, having the right skills throughout the full value chain, as we've been talking about, having that available. Regulatory certainty, how can we actually create that regulatory certainty for the industry through the institutions that we have? Creating the markets for those products, the willingness of consumers to pay for the green products, I think is another very important one. But also the engagements of citizens and communities in this whole process. I think, again, industrial policy with kind of shifting from the fossil fuels to much more renewables-based energy systems, that will be a very important element. How can we kind of create this connection much more, and therefore add value for being, for example, having industrial places within Europe and not only just focusing on subsidies.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. So now what's left to me, first of all, thank you for all the speakers. And for conclusion, I will pass the floor to Christopher. So really was exciting to see you, really having also good questions. I did not use all the questions. Some have been very detailed, mostly for Ruth, for delegated acts. So they are getting popular. So that's good news, perhaps for you, and people are studying them. But what my perception is definitely is that we are advancing rather fast now with the EU framework nearly in place and IRA nearly to be already applied. So things are moving, and it will be a rather rocky ride. Lima also indicated that it's not only bright futures that awaits us, but it's necessary transition for climate change. And Christopher, now your conclusions, please.
Thanks, Andries, and thank you very much indeed to all the panelists. It was brilliant. I thought that Lima's study was absolutely terrific and a breath of fresh air, because it raises it above the normal bickering that we manage about subsidies and green policies and this, that, and the other, to talk about fundamentals. And I thought that gives us a pause for fundamental reflection in the EU. Because if you do the Lima's EU's balance sheet, on the one hand, yep, we've got good industry. We've got third biggest steel, ammonia, whatever it is. So we've got a good industrial basis. We've certainly got the skills. We've certainly got the industry. We've certainly got the electrolyzer industry. And we certainly have the climate change policies that will drive demand. So that's all good. That's all great. But Lima also pointed out some challenges. First of all, will the member states pull in the same direction, or will they be herded like cats? Not at all. And that'll be a challenge. But above all, there was the one of cost and availability of renewables. And Ruth pointed out the huge increase in renewables we're going to need just for electrification and other energy uses. And the question is, will we have the competitive IPV renewable electricity to be able to compete with hydrogen produced somewhere else, where they do have lots of space and lots of sunshine? And Lima's indication is that that is going to be really tricky. So that gives us some really important questions for the EU at the end of the day, because we're being torn in different directions. We've talked about the subsidies, the huge subsidies of the IRA, and we talk about the EU's post-COVID fund, etc. A stupid oversimplification of a figure. So we use 10 million tons of hydrogen, industrial hydrogen in the EU today. Lima said we'll need about 700%, question more. So that gives you 70 million tons by 2050. 70 million tons is 70 billion kilos. Michael said the IRA was thinking about Matthew, $3 a kilo. So 70 billion kilos times $3 gets you $210 billion a year. So your IRA isn't going to go very far, is it? Let alone our subsidies. So the point of that stupid oversimplification is that at the end of the day, economics matter in the long term of energy policy, because trying to subsidize EU industry at 70 billion kilos a year against cheaper imports is going to be a real challenge. So in a way, that gives the EU a huge difficulty in balancing its balance sheet. Okay, so fundamental costs. Will we be able to produce the hydrogen cheaper or as cheap as imports? And there we get into the questions of import technology, which is at a nascent part. You have industrial policy questions. Does the EU really want not to be at the forefront of the development of the renewable hydrogen industry? And do we want to risk the delocalization of our steel, cement, chemicals industries to places where they do have cheap hydrogen, because our climate change objectives are not going to change? There's the one of energy security, the often thrown away phrase, do we want to swap our dependence on oil and gas for dependence on hydrogen? There's obviously budgets, because trying to subsidize expensive European renewable hydrogen, I'm not saying it is going to be expensive, that's the question, over a 50-year period at 70 billion kilos a year, once you get to 2050, is simply not sustainable. And then there's the climate issues. Michael's indications of what are likely to be the GHG requirements of, or was it Matthew? I think it was Matthew, of qualifying hydrogen in America. I haven't done the numbers, but they smelt all wrong on the basis of the GHG Delegated Act to me. But sorry, that's just a reflection, not a thought through thing. So there's all these different balances on what should the EU actually do in terms of a hydrogen policy. And of course, there's also foreign affairs, external policy. How are we going to use our hydrogen diplomacy, if you like? And the EU has not yet got a policy on this. What has it got? It has got 10 million tons domestic and 10 million tons imported, which is, I'm not saying I could do anything better, to be honest. But the time is probably coming slowly, probably not this year, but certainly for the next commission, where the EU is going to have to try and define a policy of how to make sense out of all these conflicting issues that the panelists today have brilliantly illustrated. Back to you on this.
Well, thank you, Christopher. With this, again, thank you for all the speakers. It's much appreciated. I think audience also appreciate what you have been participating here and taking your knowledge to the broader audience. I believe hydrogen is definitely a subject that requires a lot of discussion, a lot of information until it will get as boring as oil today. So it will take some time to bring us there. Thank you very much and bye.